Breaking news for you this morning. It's official. Former President Donald Trump will return to the White House after wins in key battleground states. And the Valley Today's Tatum Miller joining us now live in studio with the latest. Good morning, Tatum.
Good morning, Alex. That's right. Earlier this morning, the outcome of the 2024 presidential election was still a question. But now Donald Trump has been officially named the 47th president of the United States. Now, about an hour ago, we were monitoring this map behind me, still waiting on many races too close to call. This includes Maine, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, and Alaska. But right before 5 a.m., Wisconsin was called. So those 10 electoral votes went right to Trump, putting him at 277 total electoral votes, passing the 270 threshold to win the race. Now, Kamala sits at 224 electoral votes right now. Votes, of course, still pouring in as the states keep counting. Trump also has the majority in the popular vote as well, sitting a little over 71 million. Now, taking a closer look at Wisconsin here, you can see this was a very tight majority. Trump winning at 49.7%, with Kamala holding 48.8% of the vote. Now, he did declare presidential victory last night after Vice President Harris sent her supporters home from her election headquarters. Here's what he had to say during his victory lap.
This was a movement like nobody's ever seen before. And frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country, and maybe beyond. And now it's going to reach a new level of importance because we're going to help our country heal. We're going to help our country heal. We have a country that needs help. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
Early this morning, Vice President Kamala Harris called off her watch party early without addressing her supporters. Her campaign co-chair Cedric Richmond thanked the crowd and delivered the disappointing news that the vice president would not be speaking at the event. Harris, however, is expected to address the nation later today. Now, it's also projected that the U.S. Senate will flip to Republican control. We're taking a look at that here. But the House, however, Alex, is still undecided as we're seeing those votes pour in.
All right. Thank you so much, Tatum, for that live update.